Hello, welcome. Today I am doing my top 10 favorite films from 2022. I feel like 2022 was the year of the big blockbuster that wasn't a Marvel movie. Like the big films of the year were basically Top Gun, probably the new Batman movie, and then most recently Avatar. And even though those particular films didn't make it into my personal top 10, I had a really good time at the cinema with all of them, and they really were films that you wanted to see at the cinema. My top 10, I wasn't 100% sure what was going to be on this list when I started looking through what I'd watched last year, but on reflection I actually found heaps of films that I did really enjoy, and almost all of them are new releases as well, which is interesting, as normally I will have a few more older releases on my top list of the year. So I will start off with a few honorable mentions. Firstly, The Unbearable Weight of Massive Talent. I became a Nick Cage fan this year. I watched a few of his films in preparation for seeing this, because this film is obviously a meta action comedy about the career of Nicolas Cage, so I felt like I should be a little bit prepared and watch some of the big hitters. Face Off was definitely the favorite out of the few that I watched, and made me very keen to watch more of the films that he has done in that genre. I thought it was so fun and hilarious and just exactly what I like out of an action film. So I really enjoyed The Unbearable Weight of Massive Talent. I thought it really balanced the comedy and the making fun of pretentious acting in Hollywood and that kind of thing, while also keeping a really fun story. And it was really held together by Pedro Pascal's character being so complimentary to Nicolas Cage. You really felt that they had created this lovely friendship together, and it really fits into that theme that we saw last year of films that really work in a cinema. They're just fun to watch with a crowd, and I definitely had so much fun watching it. I also really loved Catherine Called Birdie. I did a whole video about reading the book and watching the film version, and I thought it was such a lovely and really funny YA story in a way that you don't often see. It felt really realistic to the age of the main character, Catherine, who's about 13, I believe, in the story. And I think 13-year-old girls deserve really honest and truthful depictions of people their own age, and I think this film provided that perfectly. I also really loved After Yang. Colin Farrell had a really great year last year, and while I enjoyed The Banshees of Inisherin, I think that this was his best performance of the year personally. In After Yang, he plays a sort of mopey dad who does a lot of tasks. He kind of spends a lot of the film going backwards and forwards in this futuristic underground car system, because the film is set in the future. It's basically about this family. This couple have an adopted girl. She is of Asian background, and so they decide to get a sort of humanoid robot who can teach her her culture, and he becomes basically a big brother to her, and then he starts to malfunction, and so it sort of follows the repercussions of that. It's the kind of sci-fi I really love, where it's just about like the human experience, but it just happens to be set in a future world, and everything felt so tangible, and there was a real connection to nature in the film as well. One more honorable mention is an Australian film called Sissy. This is a horror film, and I have really been getting more into horror this year. I used to absolutely avoid the genre entirely because I thought I would be too scared, but turns out that especially slasher type horrors I actually do really enjoy, because they're honestly not that different from TV shows like Midsummer Murders that I grew up with. Sissy is about this girl called Cecilia. She used to be called Sissy when she was younger, and she's an online wellness influencer, but in reality her life is very lonely and she doesn't have any friends. And then she bumps into an old school friend who invites her to her hen stew out in a country house, and you slowly learn why Cecilia isn't friends with her school friends anymore. And as you can imagine, being out in a house completely isolated in the Australian bush can lead to all kinds of horrifying events. This film is also really funny. It's a very dark comedy, and the way the main character was done was so clever, because you do really feel a lot of sympathy for her, especially if you're someone who has had friends decide not to be friends with you anymore or has felt lonely. It makes it a much more interesting character study. Alright, so I will start with number 10. And number 10 is Scream, which is technically Scream 5, but they call themselves Scream, despite the fact that the next Scream film coming out this year is apparently called Scream 6. But anyway, again, I'm so surprised to have a horror film on my list, but I really enjoy the Scream franchise, and I think it is because they are kind of a murder mystery wrapped inside a slasher horror. I thought this new version of Scream was done so well. The films have always had this meta look at horror and the current culture and society of the time that they're made in, and this one is no different. I think it played around with that meta-ness really well without it being too overdone or too annoying, and the new characters that they introduce into the story, you really care for them, and they're really well cast. All the actors are great, and this is another film that is so fun to watch in a packed cinema. And number 9 is Glass Onion, a Knives Out mystery. Knives Out is one of my favorite films of all time. I've seen it so many times and love it every single time I watch it. It was one of the rare instant 5 stars for me when I saw it for the first time. I tried to not have too many expectations of Glass Onion purely because of my love for the first film. My sister and I went and saw it in that 1 week cinema release that it got because it's a Netflix film, and I'm really glad we did see it in the cinema. It wasn't hugely packed or anything, but it was nice to be able to laugh with other people in the cinema, and I really enjoyed it. I think Rian Johnson is such a clever writer, especially in terms of character. I love the sense of humor that he imbues these stories with, and I think this one was more obviously funny, and I love the aesthetic of everything. They went full-blown Mediterranean holiday in this one, the complete opposite of the first film. Everyone's dressed in these sort of 70s-esque amazing costumes. I would say that the actual mystery and the story and the plot I don't think was as well done as the first film. I don't think all of the characters got as much to do, but it's still such a fun film. I watched it again with my parents at Christmas and still had a great time. Sorry, it kind of has to go on this list because of that. Number 8 is The Fabelmans, which is Steven Spielberg's latest film. I really thought going into this, having watched the trailer several times because of it just being played at the cinema, that this would be quite sentimental in terms of it being a love letter to cinema as it had been advertised, but it's actually way more interesting and subtle than that. It's really a film about his mother, who's played by Michelle Williams. His mother is a really good pianist, and she could have been a concert pianist if she hadn't had children, basically. Whereas his dad, played by Paul Dano, who's one of my favorites, I am very much part of the Dano Nation. He is a scientist slash engineer, something like that. He's helping to invent really important stuff anyway. From a young age, the stand-in for Steven Spielberg, who's called Sammy in the film, he has an affinity for filmmaking. And while both his parents support it, when he's younger, his dad has this idea that Sammy should eventually give it up and focus on something serious. His mother is such an interesting character, certainly from the way Michelle Williams plays her. She was really hard to get a grip on at first. I sort of was unsure of how you were meant to feel about her, but eventually you just feel both a lot of sympathy for her, not so much trapped in a marriage because she really does love her husband and her children, but she's just not having her emotional and artistic needs filled, and yet the way she behaves is also in a way quite selfish, and so she's kind of doing things that you don't necessarily agree with, but you always sympathize and empathize with her because Michelle Williams is so brilliant at playing her. I just eventually kept crying every time she opened her mouth on screen by the end of it because it was just so emotional, especially her relationship with Sammy. I really love the way Spielberg portrayed filmmaking as well. He goes into sort of some details about how he did make short films when he was a kid and all the real effects that he would use and the camera tricks, and it was really fascinating to watch things that are presumably taken directly out of his memory. Thankfully, there wasn't any moments like he doesn't see a shark and suddenly he's inspired to write Jaws. You don't have any of that. I really loved it. It really makes you feel very emotional about cinema and the power of cinema. It's also just really funny and entertaining in the way that a Spielberg film can really be. Number 9 is pretty much the only old release I have on my list, and I think this film only came out in 2021. I don't think it got a cinema release in Australia. I saw it on SBS On Demand on a streaming service. It is Ninjababy. This is a Norwegian film about a young woman who suddenly discovers she is pregnant and she is too far gone to get an abortion, which is why she calls her baby a ninja, because she didn't know it was there. She wants to be a cartoonist, and so she starts drawing these cartoons of her baby, which ends up interacting with her in the film, which actually ends up working really well amongst a film that otherwise is all very much realistically shown and told. I just thought this was such a lovely film about having to be faced with the concept of motherhood, having to decide whether it's something you want while you have a baby right there ready to go, and it's one of those stories about someone who has before been quite a childish type of person, having to grow up and become an adult. And it's just a really beautifully told story. At number 6 is Everything Everywhere All at Once. This is what I would call the ultimate indie blockbuster. It has multiple universes, traveling through these universes, kung fu fights, lots of other sci-fi concepts, but it's also just mainly about a family and about a woman called Evelyn, played by Michelle Yeoh, who sort of has to face her decisions that she's made in her life because she's suddenly seeing all these other versions of herself in these other universes of what she could have been if she hadn't moved from China to America or hadn't married her husband Waymond, and other variations. And it also is very much about her relationship with her daughter and about the experience of being a child to immigrant parents. It really is a film, I think, that has so much packed in that there's no time to even think. Like, I was just so focused on working out what was happening at any given moment that it actually took me a long time to really process what I'd seen. It was just such a true expression of these writers and directors' creative vision. Like, it just hadn't been tapered or pulled back in any way. They had truly put everything into this film, and in some ways that made it quite bloated. I think it was a little overlong, a bit repetitive in places, but because I think it's so rare to see a film like that, you kind of forgive it. I think it's one of those films that won't just be the big buzzy film of this year or last year. I think it's one that people will be talking about for a long time. At number 5, I have a film called The Phantom of the Open. This is a film directed by Craig Roberts, who starred in one of my favourite films, or it was my favourite film when I was younger, Submarine, which is directed by Richard Iwadi. I actually haven't seen Craig Roberts' other directorial movies, which I should seek out for sure. But this stars Mark Rylance as a real life person from the 80s in the UK. He was a man who decided he was going to enter the British Open and play golf, having never played it before in his life. I don't know how much of this film is actually really telling it how it was, but the way it tells it is so beautifully done for something that could have been such a standard British quirky biopic. Craig Roberts really goes out of his way to make it beautiful and aesthetic and artistic, and Mark Rylance is just so perfectly cast as this strange, awkward man who's just can't really understand why people won't let him just have a go. It's a classic working class goes up against the upper class, because obviously golf is very much, or still is very much, an upper class sport, and it definitely hits all the beats you kind of want one of those biopics to hit, but it just goes a little bit further than that, I think, and is so beautifully written and really funny. I don't think this was necessarily widely seen, so if you haven't seen The Phantom of the Open and you are a fan of those kinds of British films, I would definitely recommend it. Number 4 is a film called Official Competition. This is a Spanish film starring Penelope Cruz, Antonio Banderas and Oscar Martinez, and Penelope Cruz plays a very highly renowned indie director, and she has been hired to film an adaptation of a very famous Spanish novel. She wants these two actors to play the main roles, and so she brings them in for an extensive rehearsal period where she makes them do all kinds of ridiculous and over-the-top things, as you might imagine a famous indie director would do. And these two actors do not really get along because Antonio Banderas' character is a big Hollywood star, as he is in real life, whereas Oscar Martinez is only renowned in Spain and very much takes pride in the fact that he does quality work over big budget work. It's such a fun meta look at the film industry, and it's so interesting seeing it from the point of view of Spanish filmmakers rather than just the usual LA kind of thing, and interesting to see how similar it is as well. This film is very dark in places, it has a really dry sense of humor, very willing to make fun of everyone in this film, but you also do still really care about these characters. These actors are all so very talented that they can make you laugh at these people while also keeping them whole, well-rounded characters as well. And number 3 is Fire Island. This film is an adaptation of Pride and Prejudice, so it's kind of inevitable that it was going to be on my list because it did such a good job of making a modern gay version of Pride and Prejudice. When you think about it, there actually aren't that many modern adaptations of Jane Austen novels, and I honestly don't know why people don't do it more, because this was so well done, because it so perfectly shows how relevant Jane Austen's themes and ideas still are when you put them in that modern context. I also think the guy who played Mr. Darcy, Conrad Ricamora, I think his name is, was one of the best on-screen versions of Mr. Darcy. Definitely one of my favorites anyway. I just had so much fun working out who was which character, where all the plot points were going to come in, how they were adapted to make them fit this different scenario. But even without that, It's really well written, it's very funny, it's really touching as well. And number 2 is a film called Limbo, which I actually watched all the way back in January last year. And I think when films from the beginning of the year make it in the list, it really shows how good they are, because I'm still thinking about this film. This is about a group of refugees on a very remote Scottish island, and they are in limbo. They are waiting for the British government to decide whether they will accept their refugee status and they can stay in the UK, or whether they will have to go back. It's such a uniquely directed film. It's done in a really quirky way, which at first I thought was going to be annoying, but it actually works really well because it makes the film engaging and interesting in a way that films about topics like refugees often aren't, because I think people feel they have to be so serious about it. But there are moments that are really funny, there are moments that are really beautiful, the scenery is incredible, and it sort of lulls you into really caring about these characters before it gets quite heavy towards the end. It also really highlights how a lot of these characters don't really want to be there. They don't particularly want to live in the UK. They absolutely just have no choice, because what they remember of as home doesn't exist anymore. I just think it was such a beautifully done film and told this story in a way that's never been seen before, I think. And number 1 is, of course, Come On Come On, directed by Mike Mills. One of my favorite directors of all time. I really want to watch this film again, and I haven't, because I'm always worried with films I love that I'll watch them again and the magic will be gone. I don't think it will be the case with this film. Mike Mills just has a way of showing human nature on screen that is so accurate, and it's interesting because it feels very specific to his experiences. Joaquin Phoenix plays a radio producer. He is asked by his sister to look after his nephew, and it's about their relationship and how he has to go from being fun uncle to actually being responsible for a child, and about how the way being both a friend and a guardian to a child can really change the way you view the world in some aspects. His sister's played by Gabby Hoffman. She's really artistic. Everyone's really artistic in this film. They are a particular type of, I guess, well-off, left-leaning American, and yet the human emotions displayed still feel so universal and so relatable. The film is even in black and white, which is something that can come across as so pretentious, but it just somehow works. Can't even imagine this film being in colour in a way. Definitely a film that just made me feel all the things, and I left the cinema almost in just like shock because I didn't know how to process anything of what I just seen. That was my top 10 movies of 2022. Let me know what your favourite films were that you watched last year, if you have any recommendations. And I'm already so excited for the movies of 2023. We have Barbie coming out this year. We have Scream 6, of course, that should be coming out soon. We have Timothée Chalamet as Wonka, a musical directed by the same person who did Paddington 1 and 2. I just can't even imagine what that's going to be like, but I'm very excited. Thank you so much for watching. I will see you in my next video. Bye!